Her name became a synonym for wickedness, a word hurled at women for 3,000 years as shorthand for vanity, seduction, and moral rot. But here is what no one tells you. Every single thing that makes Jezebel infamous was not a deviation from her upbringing. It was a perfect, faithful execution of it. She did not fall from grace. She arrived as a weapon. And the kingdom she was sent to destroy never even saw her coming. To understand what she was, you have to go back further than the marriage. You have to go back to the city that made her, the father who forged her, and the religion that turned her into something the ancient world had never encountered before. A queen who used the law, the altar, and the bedroom of power with the cold precision of a surgeon performing an execution. This is not the story of a wicked woman. This is the anatomy of a perfectly engineered weapon of state. The 9th century before the Common Era was not a time for the faint of heart. The ancient Near East operated as a brutal chessboard where nations were pieces and royal daughters were the moves. Diplomacy was transacted through marriage, and marriage was transacted through daughters who were exported to foreign courts with a simple mandate: survive, assimilate, and secure the alliance. Jezebel was not exported with that mandate. She came from Tyre, and Tyre was not a city, it was a machine. Built on a narrow island off the Phoenician coast, Tyre commanded the Mediterranean with the cold efficiency of a well-oiled monopoly. Its ships threaded through every port from Spain to Egypt. Its merchants did not trade, they dominated. And the secret engine beneath all of it, the thing that paid for the warships and the palace walls and the temple hierarchies, was the most repulsive industrial process in the ancient world: purple dye. The color of gods and kings was extracted from a tiny sea snail called the murex, and the extraction was not beautiful. Tens of thousands of snails were harvested, crushed alive, and submerged in vats of brine and stale urine for days. The resulting liquid had to be boiled and reduced under open fire for weeks. The stench it produced was not merely unpleasant. Ancient Roman texts describe it as something close to the smell of a battlefield 3 days after the fighting stopped. Rotting flesh mixed with sulfur and salt. A reek so overwhelming that the Tyrian dye works were legally required to be built downwind of the city. You could smell Tyre before you saw it. Jezebel grew up inside that smell. She also grew up beneath the shadow of the temple of Baal Melkart, the patron deity of Tyre, whose name translates, with uncomfortable directness, as King of the City. This was not a warm or merciful god. The annual ritual of the temple, the egersis, the awakening of the dead deity, required something irreplaceable to burn. In the earliest records, it was an effigy. In the darkest ones, it was not. Across the Phoenician world, in the open-air sanctuaries called tophets, archaeologists have excavated thousands of small ceramic urns. Inside them, the calcined, cremated bone fragments of infants. The bones are real. The inscriptions above them are real. The Tophet at Carthage, a colony founded by Jezebel's own grandniece Dido, yielded enough urns to fill the imagination with horrors it cannot easily put down. This was not desperate murder committed in private. It was state ritual, performed in daylight, witnessed by the elite. The scholars who study it believe the psychological function was precise. By forcing the ruling class to participate in the sacrifice of their own children, the Tyrian state bound them to itself through the most irreversible act imaginable. You cannot walk away from something like that. You cannot pretend it did not happen. The shared horror became the shared secret, and the shared secret became the chain. This was the world Jezebel inherited as normal. But the most critical detail in her formation was not the religion or the dye works, or even the blood. It was her father. Ethbaal, whose name means with Baal, or enjoying the favor of Baal, was not born to the throne of Tyre. According to the Hellenistic historian Menander of Ephesus, whose records were preserved by Flavius Josephus, Ethbaal was originally the high priest of Astarte, the Phoenician goddess of fertility, sexuality, and war. He held that title until approximately 940 years before the Common Era, when he looked at the reigning king of Tyre, a man named Pheles, and made a decision. He had Pheles killed. Then he took the throne. He ruled Tyre and Sidon for 32 years. What this meant for Jezebel's psychological architecture cannot be overstated. She was raised in a palace where the man at the head of the table had personally ordered the murder of his predecessor, seized absolute secular power, and then fused it without hesitation to the supreme divine authority of the state cult. In Ethbaal's Tyre, the crown and the altar were not separate institutions with separate loyalties. They were the same fist. And because the same man held both, something extraordinary followed. Dissent became simultaneously treason and blasphemy. To question the king was to question the god. The political enemy was automatically a religious heretic. There was no neutral ground. There was no legal protection for conscience. There was only submission or destruction. And the destruction was divinely mandated, which made it clean. Jezebel absorbed this as doctrine, not as an idea she would later refine, but as the foundational truth of how power worked. She did not learn it from a text. She breathed it in the palace air, along with the smoke of the temple incense and the distant, inescapable rot of the murex vats on the coast. Complementing all of this was the cult of Astarte, Tyre's second great deity, whose economic and intelligence infrastructure was extraordinary. The Temple of Astarte operated vast networks of cultic personnel across the Phoenician world. Priests of Baal engaged in ecstatic frenzy, self-mutilation, and ritualized bloodletting to manipulate divine forces. The sensorium of the Tyrian temple was total. The visual assault of gold and carved ivory and lapis lazuli, the auditory assault of drums and shrieking, and the ululations of ecstatic worshippers, the olfactory assault of heavy frankincense and myrrh, burning day and night to mask the deeper smell of blood and rot that never fully left the city. Imagine being a child in that place. Imagine what normal means to you when that is where you live. Now imagine that child being sealed inside a royal marriage contract, packed into a Phoenician cedar wood ship, and sent east to a highland fortress city called Samaria to become the queen of a nation whose god, unlike Baal, demanded no child sacrifice, no ecstatic frenzy, no golden idols, and no compromise with foreign powers. The moment Jezebel stepped off that ship, Israel's countdown began. And it had already started without a sound. There is a particular kind of danger in a person who knows exactly what they are and has never once been made to doubt it. Most conquerors arrive with armies. The strategy is visible. The destruction is immediate. The host nation can respond because it knows what it is facing. What Jezebel brought to Samaria was something the northern kingdom of Israel had no cultural vocabulary for, a takeover that wore the face of a wedding. She did not assimilate. She infected. King Ahab of Israel was not a weak man. Let that settle for a moment, because the temptation is to read his behavior under Jezebel's influence as the behavior of a fool, and that reading misses the deeper horror. Assyrian records, specifically the Kurk monolith of Shalmaneser III, document that Ahab fielded 2,000 chariots and 10,000 foot soldiers against the Assyrian advance at the Battle of Karkar in 853 years before the Common Era. 2,000 chariots. That is not the military of a kingdom run by a coward. Ahab expanded the fortifications of Samaria, Megiddo, and Hatzor. He repeatedly outmaneuvered Aramean invasions. In the field, he was formidable. But the field was not where Jezebel fought. She operated in the domain where Ahab had no armor, the domain of absolute ideological certainty. Ahab was a politician. He understood compromise, negotiation, the strategic half-truth. He was a man who governed through pragmatism, bending when bending was cheaper than breaking. And Jezebel was none of those things. She was a high priestess who had been raised in a system where uncertainty was not a governing tool. It was a sign of heresy. She did not negotiate. She decided. She did not hesitate. She acted. She provided the dark, authorizing willpower that Ahab could use without ever having to claim it. And he allowed this again and again, because what she offered him was the luxury of clean hands. The biblical text in 1 Kings notes simply that she stirred him up. That is the most bloodless description imaginable of what was actually happening. The physical manifestation of the infection was the temple of Baal in Samaria. Ahab built it for her. Or, more precisely, Ahab signed the permit and Jezebel built it, because Ahab signing the permit was the only contribution required of him. Samaria in the 9th century was a heavily fortified highland citadel, all casemate walls and deep moats, and an elevated royal podium designed in the northern Levantine Bit-Hilani style. It was austere and military and intentionally imposing. And into the center of this fortress, Jezebel inserted a temple. The heavy smoke of foreign incense began rising from Baal's altars, drifting through the streets of the city. There was no avoiding the smell of it. It mingled with the charcoal of the cook fires and the dust of the market. And every morning, the citizens of Samaria woke up breathing the air of a city their queen was quietly overwriting. The palace itself became something else entirely. Excavations by the Crowfoot expedition and later by Kathleen Kenyon at the site of ancient Samaria recovered hundreds of Phoenician ivory plaques, small and intricate and deeply strange, decorated with Egyptian and Tyrian cultic motifs. The winged sphinx, the tree of life, the woman at the window. These were not decorative. They were ideological markers, small announcements embedded in every surface that said, Tyrian culture is superior. Tyrian power is here. The man who rules this palace has given his capital city to a woman whose God is not your God. The biblical designation for Ahab's residence was the Ivory House. The name stuck because it was accurate. Jezebel had turned the Israelite royal palace into a showroom for Phoenician cultural dominance, and she had done it one carved panel at a time. But the architecture was only the visible layer. The deeper infrastructure was the 850. First, standard theological readings treat these as pagan priests engaged in competitive religious practice. That reading is dangerously naive. In the ancient Near East, prophets were not simply holy men communing with the divine. The royal archives of Mari and the records of the Neo-Assyrian Empire document prophets, known in their cultures as Mahe, Ragimu, and Apivum, functioning as embedded political operatives in the royal court. They divined troop movements. They issued oracles justifying a king's right to rule. They identified dissenters and reported them upward through channels. In Assyria, the prophetic apparatus was so tightly integrated with state intelligence that certain oracles came with loyalty oaths attached. 850 of these operatives, imported from Phoenicia, housed in the royal city, eating from the royal treasury. Do you see what that is? It is a foreign intelligence agency, disguised as a religion. 850 sets of ears in the markets, the gates, the grain stores, and the gathering places of Israel. 850 individuals whose livelihood depended entirely on the continuation of Jezebel's power. whose God was Jezebel's God, whose survival was tied to her survival. They did not merely preach, they watched, they reported, they identified the priests of Yahweh who were preaching resistance in the countryside, the village elders who whispered that the Baal temple was an abomination, the merchants who refused to incorporate Phoenician cultic markers into their trade practices. And when those individuals were identified, Jezebel did something that was virtually unprecedented in the polytheistic ancient world. She had them hunted down and killed. Regional polytheism in the ancient Near East was, by nature, tolerant. If your conquest brought you into contact with a new deity, you absorbed that deity into your existing pantheon. You did not erase the old gods, you simply added the new ones. The practical theology of the ancient world was expansive, accumulative, and fundamentally non-exclusive. Jezebel's campaign against the prophets of Yahweh broke this rule entirely. This was not addition, this was replacement. She was not introducing Baal alongside Yahweh. She was using state resources to physically eliminate the men whose entire purpose was to maintain Yahweh's exclusive claim on Israel's soul. It was not religious violence in the spontaneous, chaotic sense. It was bureaucratic. It had a system. The prophets were identified, located, and executed. The biblical detail of Obadiah, the palace administrator, secretly hiding 100 prophets of Yahweh in caves, rationing them bread and water to keep them alive, is not a minor narrative grace note. It is a precise description of a resistance movement operating underground beneath a totalitarian surveillance state. 100 men hiding in caves, with a government official rationing supplies to keep them breathing. That is what Jezebel's 850 looked like from the inside. There is a psychological pattern in history that appears whenever a sufficiently certain ideology encounters a system with insufficient resistance. The ideology does not announce itself as a takeover, it announces itself as an improvement. It does not destroy the host institutions immediately, it captures them. It files the right paperwork. It uses the king's seal. It occupies the positions of authority, one by one, until the moment the host nation looks up and realizes the face it sees in every position of power is no longer its own. The prophets Elijah and Elisha, wandering the Israelite countryside in rough garments, eating wild food, calling down fire and drought and national catastrophe, are usually framed as figures of religious extremism. They are not. They are the immune system. They are the violent, disorganized, desperate biological response of a body that has realized, too late, that something has been eating it from the inside. And the thing eating it had been sitting at the head of the royal table for years, feeding 850 mouths, smiling. The prophets of Baal were slaughtered at the Kishon River after Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel. Every one of them, 450, dead at the river's edge. But when the news reached the palace, when Jezebel heard what the wandering prophet in the rough garment had done, she did not collapse. She did not mourn. She sent Elijah a message. It said, "By this time tomorrow, you will be where they are." And Elijah, a man who had just called down fire from the sky and executed 450 men, ran for his life. That is the measure of her. But even the most chilling thing Jezebel ever did was not the genocide. It was more intimate than that. It was quieter. It involved a vineyard, a letter, a royal seal, and an innocent man who never saw a single assassin. There are two ways to destroy a man. You can use violence, which is fast and obvious and leaves fingerprints, or you can use the law. The law is slower, but it is perfect. It has no fingerprints. It has witnesses. It has procedure and precedent, and the moral authority of the community itself. When the law kills a man, it does so with everyone's hands, which means it does so with no one's hands. Jezebel understood this. It was, in a sense, the most sophisticated thing she ever did. The incident of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings chapter 21 is usually taught as a morality tale about greed. That reading is correct as far as it goes, and it does not go nearly far enough. Naboth owned a piece of land adjacent to the royal palace in Jezreel. Ahab wanted it for a vegetable garden. He offered Naboth a fair market price, or an equivalent plot of land elsewhere. Naboth refused. Not because he was stubborn, because he was legally and theologically correct. Levitical law was explicit. Ancestral land was a divine grant given by Yahweh to the tribe and could not be permanently alienated from the family line. Naboth was not negotiating. He was citing chapter and verse. The land was not his to sell. It was his to steward. Ahab understood this. That is the critical detail that most readings discard. He understood it, accepted it, returned to the palace, lay down on his bed, turned his face to the wall, and refused to eat. A petulant king, goes the common reading, a man sulking like a child. But watch it again more slowly. Ahab was not simply sad. He was performing helplessness in front of the most dangerous person in his palace. By lying down, turning away, and making his suffering visible, he created a vacuum. He announced, without words, that someone needed to fill the space he had vacated. And the only person in that palace with both the will and the networks to fill it was his wife. When Jezebel walked into his room and demanded to know whether he governed Israel or not, she was stepping into a trap he had constructed specifically for her. He would not be the one who moved against Naboth. He would be the one who arrived afterward to collect what remained. His hands would be clean because he had made sure to be useless at exactly the right moment. Jezebel wrote the letters herself. She sealed them with Ahab's royal signet, the stamp of supreme legal authority. She sent them to the elders and nobles of Jezreel, the men who ran the municipal apparatus of the city where Naboth's vineyard sat. The instructions in those letters were 4 steps, and every single step was legal. Step 1. Proclaim a fast. In the Israelite legal tradition, a fast was not a private act of piety. A communal fast was a judicial emergency measure convened when the community believed it was under divine judgment for a hidden sin. The most famous precedent was the story of Achan in the book of Joshua, where a single man's secret crime caused the entire community to suffer defeat, and the fast was how they identified and purged the troubler. By declaring a fast in Jezreel, Jezebel manufactured a city-wide atmosphere of paranoia. She told the entire population, without naming anyone, "There is a traitor among you. There is someone here whose sin is making God angry at all of you." And the community, primed by their own theology, immediately understood their collective responsibility to identify and excise the problem. Step 2. Seat Naboth at the front of the assembly. This moved him from the crowd into the position of the accused, the prominent man singled out for examination, without ever formally charging him with anything. The optics accomplished what a formal accusation would have telegraphed too early. Step 3. The 2 witnesses. Jezebel explicitly ordered that 2 men, worthless men, scoundrels, be placed opposite Naboth and instructed to testify against him. 2 witnesses was not an arbitrary number. It was the precise number mandated by Deuteronomy for a capital conviction. 1 witness was insufficient to execute a man. 2 established legal certainty. Jezebel cited the protective law, the safeguard specifically designed to prevent false convictions, and used it as the instrument of the murder. She did not circumvent the legal protection. She weaponized it. Step 4. The charge. Blasphemy and treason, cursing God and the king. Blasphemy alone under Levitical law required death by stoning, but the treason charge was the masterpiece. Under ancient Near Eastern legal codes, including the Middle Assyrian laws and Babylonian precedents, a man executed for treason against the crown did not pass his estate to his heirs. His property reverted directly to the crown. Naboth would die. His sons would die with him, a detail confirmed in the second book of Kings, to ensure no inheritance claim survived. The vineyard would belong to Ahab, not by theft, but by legal forfeiture following a properly conducted trial. The elders and nobles of Jezreel received the letters. They read them. They looked at the royal seal, and they complied. Every single one of them. Not one man stood up in that assembly and said, "We all know Naboth. We all know the charges are false. We will not do this." The silence of those elders is the loudest thing in the story. They did not comply because they believed the charges. They complied because they were afraid. And they were afraid because they had watched, over the preceding years, what happened to the people who said no. They had seen the Yahwistic priests disappear. They had heard the rumors of what lived in the caves outside the city. They understood the intelligence network watching them from the temple. And when the letter arrived bearing the seal of a king who had surrendered his authority to a woman from Tyre, they made the calculation that fear always produces. Compliance is survival. Conscience is a luxury. So they proclaimed the fast. They seated Naboth. They produced the scoundrels. The testimony was delivered. The crowd heard the charges. And then the crowd, the ordinary citizens of Jezreel, the neighbors of Naboth, the people who had watched him tend his vineyard for years, picked up stones and killed him. This is the true horror of the Naboth conspiracy. Not the legal mechanism, not even the death. It is what the law was made to do in Jezebel's hands, render the community complicit in the murder of its own innocent member. Turn every hand in Jezreel into a weapon aimed at a man who had done nothing except follow the law with perfect fidelity. When it was done, a message arrived at the palace. Naboth has been stoned and is dead. Jezebel walked to Ahab's room. She found him exactly where she had left him. And she said, in the flat, efficient language of someone completing an administrative task, "Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead." Ahab arose. He went down to the vineyard. He stepped across the blood-soaked ground of the legal system he had allowed his wife to hollow out, and he walked to the edge of the property, and he stood there in the sun, and he looked at the vegetables he intended to grow. He had not laid a single finger on Naboth. He had not written a single word of those letters. He had not ordered a single soldier. The system had simply functioned. And the function had produced exactly what he needed. But standing at the edge of that vineyard, a voice reached him before he could take another step. The voice of Elijah the Tishbite, who had a word from God about dogs and blood and a wall in Jezreel. And Ahab heard it, and for one brief moment, he understood. But understanding came too late. The machinery was already in motion, and the machinery did not ask for permission to reach its conclusion. The reckoning was not coming for Ahab. Not yet. It was coming for the woman who had signed his name to 40 years of ruin. 841 years before the Common Era. The northern kingdom of Israel has endured Ahab and then his sons Ahaziah and Joram. The Omride dynasty has presided over the kingdom for nearly 40 years, and now a general named Jehu has received a prophetic commission, a jar of oil poured over his head by a young prophet from Elisha's school, and a singular, world-ending instruction: destroy the house of Ahab. Jehu moves with the controlled speed of a man who has been waiting a long time for this particular order. He kills Joram, the king of Israel, with an arrow through the chest, on the very plot of ground that had once been Naboth's vineyard. The biblical narrator notes this with a satisfaction that vibrates across 3,000 years. He kills Ahaziah, king of Judah, on the road, and then he drives his chariot through the gate of Jezreel. Word arrives at the palace before he does, because, of course it does. Jezebel has run an intelligence network for 40 years. She knows what is coming. She has enough time to make a choice. She chooses. And the choice she makes is the most psychologically devastating thing she does in the entire story. She does not flee. She does not beg. She does not attempt to negotiate, seduce, bribe, or hide. She goes to her cosmetics. 2 Kings, chapter 9, verse 30. She painted her eyes with puk and adorned her head and looked out at the window. Puk is the Hebrew word for kohl, the dark antimony-based powder ground on stone pallets and applied with a thin ivory applicator to the rim of the eyelid. The application is deliberate, requires stillness of hand, takes time. She did it knowing a general with her son's blood on his wheels was riding toward the gates. She arranged her headdress. She positioned herself at the window. And she waited. For centuries, the standard interpretation of this scene has been that of a desperate, aging seductress making a last attempt to charm her executioner. This reading is not merely wrong. It is the exact reading Jehu's propagandists wanted you to have, and the exact reading she was daring you to reject. The coal pots found in excavations at Samaria and Ugarit, small polished stone vessels with ivory applicators, date precisely to the 9th century. Cosmetics in the ancient Near East were not vanity items. They were ritual materials, associated explicitly with ceremonial preparation of the body. The Ugaritic text, known as KTU 1.161, one of the ancient Near Eastern mourning manuals that govern the treatment of the dead, specifies the ritual anointing and beautification of the corpse as part of the preparation for the afterlife journey. Jezebel was not applying makeup. She was preparing her own body for burial. She knew she was going to die in the next few minutes. She chose to die painted, adorned, and positioned, because to die otherwise, pale and disheveled and cowering in the inner rooms, would mean Jehu's version of the story was the only version. She was writing the counter-narrative with her own hands. The coal was not a seduction. It was a funeral mask applied by its owner. And the window. The window is everything. Throughout the ancient Levant, from Samaria to Arslan-Tash, Phoenician ivory artists carved the same image over and over. A heavily adorned woman gazing out from a balustraded window, her headdress elaborate, her jewelry visible, her posture one of absolute composure. Scholars who study the motif call it the woman at the window, and every serious analysis of it connects it to the same source. Astarte, the Phoenician goddess, looking out from her celestial palace at the world below. Jezebel chose that window deliberately. She arranged herself in that posture deliberately. She forced Jehu to look up at her, to be the one below, to be the supplicant looking upward at the figure in the high place. Despite his military victory, despite the bodies of her sons cooling somewhere behind him on the road, she occupied the elevated position. She was not performing, she was claiming. She looked down at him, and then she spoke. "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" Jehu had never heard the name Zimri applied to himself, but every Israelite alive knew what it meant. Decades before Jezebel arrived in Israel, a chariot commander named Zimri had done exactly what Jehu was now doing. He had assassinated his king, seized the throne, and declared himself ruler of the northern kingdom. His reign lasted 7 days. 7. Because the Israelite army heard what he had done and immediately proclaimed their commanding general, a man named Omri, as the rightful king. Omri marched on the capital of Tirzah. Zimri, watching the walls fall, walked into the royal palace, set it on fire, and burned to death inside it rather than be taken. Jezebel was not asking a question. She was delivering a verdict. She was standing at the window of the palace her father-in-law Omri had built and telling the general below that the Omrides always crush this kind of thing. She was planting in him the seed of the paranoia that destroys every usurper, the knowledge that the people who helped you betray your master will one day betray you in exactly the same way. And you will spend every hour of your reign waiting for the sound of their chariots. She was telling him that his victory was already rotting from the inside. She died cursing him. That was the choice. Jehu looked up at the window and called out to the eunuchs behind her. 2 or 3 of them, men who had served her for decades, threw her from the window. The impact killed her, but Jehu's chariot did the rest. He drove over her body in the courtyard. The horse's hooves and the chariot wheels ground the Queen of Israel into the packed earth of the palace she had built. And then Jehu went inside, sat down, washed his hands, ate. The woman who had fed 850 prophets from her royal table lay broken in the courtyard below the dining room, and the man who had killed her ate without hurry in her chair, at her table, in the palace she had spent 40 years occupying. He remembered her eventually. He sent his men out to bury her, noting coldly that she was, whatever else she might have been, a king's daughter. An international incident with Sidon was not something he needed. The men went into the courtyard. They found the skull, the palms, the feet. Nothing else. Forensic science provides the biological explanation that the ancient world dressed in theology. Canid scavengers work efficiently and with a specific logic. They target the nutrient-dense soft tissues first, the torso, the abdomen, the muscular mass of the limbs. They work quickly in packs. What they leave behind are the anatomical structures with the least accessible flesh, the dense carpals and metacarpals of the hands, the tarsals of the feet, the thick vault of the skull. The dogs left exactly those 3 things. But the biblical author did not see bone density. The biblical author saw the precision of divine poetry and arranged it on the page accordingly. The skull, the seat of the Machiavellian intelligence that engineered the Naboth conspiracy, the mind that looked at Israel's own holy laws and saw not protection, but a mechanism, left in the dirt of Jezreel, exposed to weather, unretrievable, unknown. The palms, the hands that held Ahab's royal signet ring, that pressed the seal into warm wax on the letters that killed Naboth, that directed the religious genocide of Yahweh's prophets, lying in the courtyard mud, disarticulated and still. The feet, the path she walked from the cedar-scented docks of Tyre into the highlands of Israel, carrying the ideological pathogen that would consume the Omride dynasty and set the northern kingdom on a trajectory toward its eventual annihilation at the hands of Assyria. Scattered on the ground that was once the property of the man her letters had killed. Elijah had said it years before, standing at the edge of Naboth's stolen vineyard, speaking to a king who had stepped over the body of his legal system to collect a vegetable garden. In the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the surface of the field, so that no one can say, "This is Jezebel." No one could say, "This is Jezebel." That was the final verse. The woman who had arrived in Israel determined to overwrite its identity had been overwritten herself. The soft flesh of her Tyrian luxury, her purple robes, her coal and her ivory, and her 850 voices, consumed entirely. What remained was harder than all of it. 3 bones, anonymous and scattered, belonging to no one. She had entered Israel as an unstoppable weapon. She exited as something smaller than a burial. And here is the irony that sits at the center of everything. The irony that changes the entire story if you let it. Jezebel was the only person in this story who was exactly what she claims to be. Every other player hedged. Ahab performed helplessness to keep his hands clean. The elders of Jezreel performed compliance to keep their bodies safe. Even Elijah, the great prophet of Yahweh, ran for his life into the desert after Carmel and sat under a juniper tree and asked God to let him die. But Jezebel, a woman who was an ideological weapon embedded in a foreign court, a woman who knew by the time Jehu's chariot crested the hill that she had lost everything, still looked out the window, still painted her eyes, still spoke. The person history calls the monster was the only one who never pretended. Think about the people in your life who operate with that kind of absolute certainty. The ones who never waver, never hedge, never perform doubt or humility or accommodation for your benefit. The ones who know exactly what they are and have never once been invited to question it. They are not always wrong, but they are always dangerous, because the only check on absolute certainty is the kind of suffering that breaks certainty open. And some people are constructed in such a way that even suffering cannot reach that far. Jezebel never had that kind of suffering, not in the sense that would have reformed her. She had the suffering of a woman who watched her world collapse and chose to die on her own terms rather than someone else's. She had the suffering of 3 bones on the ground of a city she had once owned. Was she the monster? Or was she the only honest participant in a story full of people who wanted what she provided, but refused to admit it? Here is the question she leaves behind, the one that has no clean answer. If you had been one of the elders of Jezreel when that letter arrived, sealed with the royal signet, carrying instructions that you knew were a death warrant for a man you knew was innocent, and you looked at your family, your property, your children, and you thought about the intelligence network watching from the temple down the road, and you thought about what had happened to the men who said no before you, would you have picked up the stone? Or would you have done something that preserved Jezebel's power as surely as compliance did, and simply looked away? The answer says everything about you, and it says everything about why, 3,000 years later, the name is still on our lips. The story of Jezebel is over, but the forces that created her, the certainty, the surveillance, the law weaponized by the powerful against the innocent, the powerful who require willing hands to carry out what they have designed but cannot be seen to touch. Those are not ancient history. They are not even history. There is a figure who has appeared in every empire that came after Tyre. The ideological weapon exported inside a political alliance, the one who fuses divine authority with secular power and calls anyone who objects a heretic. The next chapter of what Tyre built is a story that will not stay inside the 9th century, and it has already begun somewhere you have not been looking.